You choose, yeah. Okay.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Professor Hala Kamal, for joining us, for accepting to do this talk to the MA translation students at the Islamic University. This is Rifat Tagir. I am the instructor of literary translation, which is a course at MA program. Okay, can everybody mute themselves? Professor Hala Kamal is a professor of English literature and gender studies at Cairo University. She also teaches comparative literature at the American University in Cairo. She has published several articles. I already sent these three of these articles to my students who hopefully read at least two of them. One of them was the experience of translating the encyclopedia of women and gender in Islamic cultures. The other is translating feminist literary theory into Arabic. And the third article is traveling concepts in translation, feminism and the gender in the Egyptian context. Today, Professor Hala is going to talk about reflections on feminist translation. Hopefully, I'm sure this is going to be very beneficial. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Hala. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you, Dr. Rifat, for inviting me. This is really a great privilege for me because it's my first direct Zoom contact with the Islamic University of Gaza. I have some colleagues in Birzeit because there's the Department, of course, of Women's Studies there. But I'm really privileged to have this opportunity to talk to students in the University of Gaza. I'm planning to combine some of the what I consider main points from my papers that I shared with you. And I will be focusing basically on the notion of feminist translation praxis. And by this, I mean it is feminist translation practice that is very well grounded in theory. And as I was telling Dr. Rifat before the beginning of this session, I started developing my interest in translation studies pretty late. Late, I mean relatively late, a little over 15 years now. Because I'm originally, I studied English literature in the Department of English at Cairo University. My master's was in post-colonial literature. My PhD was in autobiography, theory and writing, and women's writing in particular. And since 1990s, when I was still a recent graduate and I started working at Cairo University, I was asked, because I was known as a good student in translation and I have good grounding in Arabic literature and Arabic language, which is a necessity, and it is usually something that is missing. People either speak excellent Arabic, but good English, not very good, or excellent English and, well, good Arabic, but not really very good. So I started translating some texts for basically magazines, literary journals in Egypt. But of course, my main interest throughout in my master's and in my PhD were both connected mainly to sorry, I have just to check with this the sound. So sorry. Okay, so this is how it started, because I started working on women's texts. My interest was feminist theory, women's writing. And therefore, when I was beginning to translate in a more organized way, I started looking for the theoretical framing for whatever there was in translation theory that had to do with feminism, if at all. And this is where I came across the works of Louise von Flotow in particular. And then through her, I started reading more in a more organized way. Okay, sorry. It's just that I'm at home today, so you will have some sounds from, family background. Anyway, so this is how it all started. Now, what I'm going to share with you is a combination of, as I said, some research that I have done and some ideas that I have come across and tried to apply to my own practice of translation. One of which was a big project that you are familiar with, which was the translation of IWIC, the Encyclopedia of Women in Islamic Civilization. And this was a project that I was basically asked to coordinate. I translated one entry, one encyclopedic entry, I think, or a couple, but I coordinated. So it involved a lot of discussions. And then also I was asked to coordinate and get involved in a project at the Women in Memory Forum, which is a feminist organization in Egypt. And we issued a number of books that were designed as, in a way, readers across different disciplines. They are all available in Arabic, in PDF. I can share with you the links later on. A volume on feminism and historical studies, النسوية والدراسات التاريخية، النسوية والنقد الأدبي. This was mine. And then there were others, النوع والعلوم السياسية، النسوية والدراسات الدينية. And this again added a lot, because through this we were a group of translators and we met to discuss certain issues, and I was coordinating it. So I was the most concerned not only with the practical aspect, but also with the theoretical grounding. And this is how I came across feminist translation theory and started reading in it extensively and using it as an approach to my own translation practice along the years. So one of the ideas that I think we'll all connect to is Edward Said very important article on traveling theory, 1982. Of course, he meant literary theory. And he said, like people in schools of criticism, ideas and theories travel from person to person, from situation to situation, from one period to another, leading to processes of transplantation, transfer, and circulation, commerce of theories and ideas. So he spoke of theories of criticism. But again, when we think of translation, this is exactly what happens to texts. Texts travel, and they travel just like theory travels. And we as mediators, as translators, we are the vehicle, we are the train, we are the bus, we are the plane. And throughout the process, we need to again think about what happens to a translated text during the journey, not only the product itself. So this is one idea that I think is crucial for us to think of ourselves as translators, as mediators, not only as walking dictionaries. Another idea, Mickey Ball is a Dutch German critic who again built her study of narratology in particular, and the humanities on Edward Said's idea of traveling theory, and she started reflecting on traveling concepts. So she states that in interdisciplinary cultural analysis, methods are usually fixed. So we know that even when we do research, we use a fixed method, while concepts are the sites of debate, awareness of difference, tentative exchange, and so on and so forth. So again, concepts, terminology moves. It's not just a text that moves, but also terminology travels. So this is another idea that I wanted also to introduce to all of us. And then the third point is about Marwa Shakri, who is yes, can we mute everybody? Maybe I will just mute. Okay, I'm muting here. I'm using my power to mute. Okay, I hope that nobody minds this, right? Because is that fine?
Yes, okay, sorry for the inconvenience.
No problem. So Marwa Shakri is an Egyptian scholar who works in Western academia, and she's by training, I think she's a physicist, physics, but she has done she wrote a very interesting book about the translation of Darwin into Arabic. She traced what happened to Darwin's theory of evolution when it was translated from English into Arabic 100 years ago. And again, in her study of the translation of Darwin into Arabic, Marwa Shakri focuses on the translocation of scientific knowledge through translation into Arabic at the turn of the 20th century. And she states that the practice of translation involves often very substantial epistemological, authorial, and literary shifts across cultures and over time. So these are three statements that I wanted to share with you before we start thinking more closely about women and translation. And I think what is interesting here is this emphasis on basically yes, there are. Rifat, do you have did you transfer?
You have all the power.
Okay, so all right, so I will have to be muting myself. All right, okay.
Guys, could you mute yourself, Afnan and Shayma? Could you please mute yourselves? Thank you.
Now, can you see the slides?
Yes, knowledge in motion.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So those ideas of, that concepts and texts actually travel, and we need to think about what happens to them when they travel. This has been done in relation to, of course, critical concepts, but also, as we can see with Marwa Shakri, she also discussed this in relation to science. What happens to scientific knowledge, such as theories in biology, when they travel from one culture to the other. Now, my concern is, of course, more with feminism and the circulation of knowledge. And therefore, I would like also to focus more on thinkers who are mainly concerned with feminist translation studies. And as I said, Louise von Flotow here is one of the important figures. She says that one of the challenges facing transnational feminist studies is the hegemony of English in academic publishing and how this affects the circulation of feminist texts from beyond the Anglo-American Eurozone. So again, this is a very important point, that most of the work that is done in translation is when it comes to theory, the theory about translation studies is mainly produced in English. And even people like myself and you, Dr. Rifat, when we do research, when we work, we have to produce in English so as to be able to publish. We also get ourselves in a position where we have the question, do we translate from English into our culture and why? And do we translate from Arabic to English and why? And not only why, but what and when and so on. So definitely we are at the age where English dominates. And this also is reflected in works about women in what is known as feminist discourses and therefore feminist translation. So what is feminist translation? Feminist translation studies exists at the intersection of feminist theory, literary theory, and translation studies. And when it comes to feminist translation practice, the practice itself is grounded in the theory in many ways, as the term Praxis tells us. So any feminist translator or a translator with a feminist sensitivity, with gender sensitivity, will always raise some questions about foreignization, visibility, voice, affinity, specialization, agency. And these are points that I'm going to refer to in more detail in a minute. So again, we're going to think about, and this is what will come in the next slides, about strategies of feminist translation into Arabic. How do we go about working with translation about women with knowledge of feminist translation theory? So one of the earliest ideas, concepts in feminist translation was raised by Barbara Goddard, a translator herself and a theorizer from the 1980s, Canadian. She said that translation is a process of transformation. And the translator is actually a rewriter. And you have to be conscious of this process, because if you want to establish the ethics of translation, then you need to be very cautious about your power in transforming the text, and therefore trying to avoid rewriting, trying to be as close as possible to the source text. If you do not acknowledge the power of rewriting as a translator, if you do not acknowledge the power of transformation as a translator, then you might actually take the text away from its original text, because at the end of the day, a translator is a mediator. Gayatri Spivak, who is an Indian post-colonial feminist thinker, discussed translation as submission. She believes that a translator is essentially a reader. And as a reader, I have to submit to the source text. Of course, these are all things that we practice as we work, but feminist translation tells us, please keep these particularly clear in your minds. And then when you translate, you have to explain your positions regarding these powers that you have as a translator. When Gayatri Spivak reminded us that we have to, as translators, we have to be essentially readers, and we have to submit to the source text, she was referring particularly to the post-colonial structures, where we have the British, formerly colonizers, taking the power of translating our literature into English. And when they do that, Edward Said told us in Orientalism, they transform it without acknowledging the transformation. So Gayatri Spivak tells us, hello, you British, American translators, when you translate our subaltern texts, you have to translate with a sense of submission rather than control. So because you should be thinking of yourselves as readers, transferring the text to readers, not trying to impose a certain understanding. And we know what kind of understanding the West has towards us, what can happen in a transformation of texts, in this translation of texts, if you do not have translators who are culturally aware. Louise von Flotow tells us that, additionally, that translation is actually an act of activism, because you as a feminist, you are actually intervening. When you choose what you want to translate, then you are intervening. When you choose how to translate, you are practicing activism. And I think this will be much clearer to you as Palestinian students and translators, because you are definitely much more aware than the average translator of the politics behind translation. You are probably exposed to this constantly. And Luis von Floto is alerting us to this power, the activism that can be involved in the process of translation through the selection of what you translate and how you translate it and who you are addressing and with what target, with what aim. In that sense, there is a connection here, of course, between theory, feminist theory, of literary theory, the text, and translation studies strategies. And occasionally, of course, you can have added aspects that are more political, perhaps, such as post-colonial theory. In your case, probably very direct national politics would come also into play. Now, to move on to the discussion of strategies, I would like to raise this question. Feminist translation praxis. One of the strategies is foreignization. Do you know what is foreignization in translation?
Yes, we study Venuti.
Yes, can someone, yes, just one person raise a hand. I would like just to add some interaction so that people don't fall asleep. Yes, anyone would like to tell us what you know about foreignization? Okay, Arwa.
Yes, it is a strategy used to keep the foreignness of the text. So yes, we don't make the expressions used in the source text more like appropriate or more well known to the readers.
Exactly.
The foreignness of the text is kept in this by using this strategy.
Okay, Reem, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to say that it's simply bringing the reader into the text rather than
Exactly.
vice versa.
Exactly. So these are the two, right? The two approaches. There's the approach of bringing the reader to the text and the approach of bringing the text to the reader. Obviously, you've done that in your readings. Let me go back to the slides and let's see what Venuti told us. You've probably read Venuti. Lawrence Venuti connects domestication with invisibility and violence and foreignization with resistance. So according to him, if you foreignize a text, it means that you keep the text, as you have pointed out, as it is. You are not transforming it, you are not domesticating it, you are not turning it into a simplified version that would be easily understood by the target language reader, but you are keeping the sense of its foreignness. Now, if you think of feminist translation, and in general, political translation in many ways tends towards foreignization because it reflects the methodologically coincides with feminist ethics. In what way? Because when you're translating a feminist text into Arabic, you are trying to establish its feminism rather than trying to mute it to fit some cultural reservations or tendencies towards more reserved, more conservative than there might be in the text. My other question is, you're definitely now familiar also with the notion of visibility in translation. Yes? Anybody would like to remind us what is visibility in translation? Rahaf, yes?
Yes. Hi, first of all. Visibility in translation is how visible the translator is when he or she translates. So there are some theories that say that the translator should be invisible when he translates. He or she, of course, translates, so that we can maintain the source text just as it is, and the author is the most visible person. However, there are other theories that say that the translator must be visible because the translator is a great contributor to the text, and we can't deny that.
Absolutely, thank you. Yes, exactly. Reem, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, simply is that the visibility of translation is that both translators and authors should be of, like not, يعني they shouldn't be dependent on one on another, and a translation shouldn't be like a pale part of glass. If the text is to seem as a translated text, then it would be, like appropriate. But if it seems like a rewriting of the text, it would be more of appropriation, then it wouldn't be that to the source text,
Absolutely, yes. So what do again, what does the theory tell us? Lawrence Venuti tells us that the translator's invisibility is a weird self-annihilation. It's like a translator is annihilating himself or herself, a way of conceiving and practicing translation that undoubtedly reinforces its marginal status in Anglo-American culture. And of course, we know that until today, we've always had the saying, ده مترجم لما تقرأ الترجمة ما تحسش إنه النص مترجم. يعني this is something that we say all the time as an example of perfect translation, that as you translate, you cannot even sense that this is a translation. And that is because the translator is completely invisible. And the visibility, how can we attain the visibility of a translator? The visibility, can you tell me, how do we attain the visibility? Yara?
I believe that when the translator knows about the language, the other language that he's translating, he gets more of a sense of what the writer is trying to deliver. So
yes.
The knowledge of the other language is important to whether it will be visible or not, or invisible.
Exactly. And sometimes with, particularly when it comes to translation studies, there is emphasis on writing an introduction, including footnotes, adding a glossary. All these are signs that the translator is there, is part of the production of the text in the target language. Maggie Hum, in a dictionary of feminist theory, tells us that feminist literary theorists argue that the representation of the voice in literature by women writers is a textual strategy used by writers to deconstruct images of women inherited from old literature. So the idea is that this concept of voice in literature, concept of voice in a text that you are translating, when you are sensitive, your voice as a translator can appear. And sometimes even we know that there are some translators who have achieved such degree of establishing their own voices as translators, to the extent that if you take a translation, you can guess. One of such people are, for instance, in Egypt is Dr. Muhammad Ainani. Dr. Muhammad Ainani has translated most of Shakespeare's plays. And of course, there are criticisms about the translations and so on. We've had so many versions of Shakespeare since Khalil Mutran and before that, different versions, different approaches. But with Muhammad Ainani, it is almost obvious when you pick up the book that this seems like, because he as a translator has developed his own voice in translation. And this voice becomes, it's not about translating his own words, but it is the use of style. It is an imprint of the translator. And this is why it is important not to allow editors to rewrite our translations when we translate. Not to allow what we sometimes face with when you send a book to translation with المدقق اللغوي أو المصحح. So for instance, I would write المترجم والمترجمة, and then they would say المترجم معروفة. Why do you repeat? ما هو معروف إنه المقصود هنا الرجل أو المرأة. Or the same thing, of course, is in the plural, and we will come to that in a while. Now, the third point is about the simpatico translator. Are you familiar with the term? Yara?
هو أنا كنت بدي أضيف إشي على النقطة اللي فاتت.
Yes.
في كتاب لبثينة الإبراهيمي اللي هو صاحب الظل الطويل Daddy Long Legs for Jane Webster. قرأت الكتاب الجزء، كان كتير ممتع وما بتحس إنه مترجم، لكن متى الواحد بيعرف إنه مترجم أو مش النص مش اللغة الأصلية في الأسماء الأجنبية، الأسماء الأجنبية فقط، أما دون عن ذلك كان كتاب جدا رائع. فكيف ممكن نحل الموضوع هذا كترانسليترز؟
إن إحنا الأسامي الأجنبية نتصرف فيها إزاي؟
لأنه بعض الترانسليترز بيحاولوا الأسماء لأسماء عربية، يعني يكون في شوية
ما هو لما نحول الأسماء لأسماء عربية يبقى احنا هنا we're turning the text into adaptation. يبقى احنا هنا هي فيها درجة من الادابتيشن. خلاص احنا خرجنا هنا من pure translation into a degree of adaptation اللي هي بتسميه، وهنرجع للنقطة دي دلوقتي، اللي هي I don't know if you can see the slides now.
Yes.
في نقطة هنتكلم عنها بعد شوية and I didn't stop at it. هي فكرة ال hijacking. Louise von Flotow names and describes 3 practices of feminist translation. بتقول إنه as we translate, we supplement. We know that. We write prefaces, we write footnotes. But sometimes a text can be hijacked. And she uses this term. Hijacked is in that sense. When you change the names, خلاص يبقى أنا كده when I read it, I think that all of this is happening to Egyptian characters in the Arab world, which is actually a process of hijacking rather than translation as such. The point about the simpatico translator is a point that was raised again by Venuti, who said that usually a good translation of a text would be done by a translator who is a simpatico translator. Simpatico is from Italian, because we know that Lawrence Venuti is of Italian origin, and most of his translation was done English, Italian, and he was referring to affinity. He said that usually for a good translation, the translator should really be comfortable with the material that he or she is translated. And I can definitely agree with this, because if I am translating a text, let's say even in your case, in the Palestinian scene, if you're translating a text that is anti-Palestinian, if I'm translating a text that is anti-Arab, I will definitely have a kind of a position that can lead to ethical questions in my translation. So it's better for me if I feel strongly against a text, not to translate it unless I am translating it for certain concrete purposes, maybe political or maybe academic. But according to Venuti, again, for a good translation, you should be in a kind of an affinity with the text. Lawrence speaks of the simpatico translator, an idea that he adopted, then abandoned as a translator. بعد شوية, he decided that a simpatico translator actually can be biased not biased against, but biased with. And therefore it becomes problematic. So, but he raised this, that we have to think as translators, we stop and think about our position towards what we are translating. And therefore also if you think of translators of sacred texts, if you have a certain position, an anti-religious position, and you start translating a religious text, I think that this position will influence your translation. Again, across ideology, if you are a Marxist and you are translating texts about capitalism, liberal policies, propagating them, I think that a Marxist translator will also, your own position will come into play. So you have to be aware of it, because again, translation is mediated by us translators. So although at the beginning, Venuti himself propagated the simpatico translation, he himself speaks of the pitfalls that could accompany this when a translator is too close to the text or the author of the text. And this is a very, again, technical, a very delicate, I mean, not technical, a very delicate aspect, because it involves emotions, not only technicalities of translation. The last point that I wanted also to highlight is specialization. And many people believe, many translators translate across specializations. And they believe that if you are a good professional translator, you can translate anything. Do you think it is possible, if you are a good translator, to be able to translate anything? Arwa?
Can I?
Arwa?
Yes. Actually, I think that even if like translation may be like art, a kind of art, but even if we have like the professional, let me say, mechanism of translation, some fields need a kind of specialization. We need background knowledge and information about the field we are working on or translating, such as like when we translate technical text.
Exactly, absolutely. Now, the question, Rahaf, you want to say something?
Yes, I would actually like to say, I think yes, we do need a level of specialization, because when speaking about linguistically speaking, knowing the right terminology and the right lexical words to use is not enough when it comes to translating. You need to understand the culture behind that, let's say, field you're translating. You need to know the effects of certain words, and even if they are correct linguistically, what would their effect be on the reader and in the target culture?
Absolutely, Rahaf. Reem, you want to also add something?
Yes, the things that a translator, I believe that a translator should have interest in both, the topic that he or she will be translating, as well as the translation techniques and strategies. And
Absolutely.
This is as you added in your article, that how you chose the translators for the
exactly. Absolutely. Wallerstein tells us that the translator must be someone not merely skilled in translation as a generalized technique, but familiar with the literature of the subfield over a long period of time. So if you are translators in Islamic studies, it is not just a matter of knowing the language. It is not only just the matter of, but you have to have knowledge in Islamic studies.
Yes.
Exactly, like if you are translating, why do we take a text in Islamic studies and we think that we can translate it? I wouldn't be able to translate it without enough knowledge. To me, it is very similar to if somebody gives me a text in chemistry or biology and they think that since I know Arabic, I can translate a text from English into Arabic because it is a matter of language. No, there is a lot about the field of knowledge itself. As Wallerstein tells us, the subfield over a long period of time, preferably someone with a direct interest in the material under discussion in the text. So a translator of feminist text should have specialized knowledge of feminist theory and terminology, in addition to the linguistic and stylistic ability. To move on, what are the requirements for feminist translation in terms of language? Yeah, it's prayer time here. Okay. Let's continue.
Would you like any participant here?
Yes. What are the requirements for feminist translation? If we're thinking about language, we know that we need to know. Yes, we need to know.
We have Dr. Professor Mohammed Al-Haj Ahmed is an associate professor of translation and a colleague of mine.
Yes, of course. Yes, you're welcome.
Go on,
I'm using my son's name here. Okay, thank you, Dr. Hala, for this interesting class, talking to us from Cairo. Yes. What you are suggesting here is nice for feminist translate for family. Okay, working in feminist theory. Okay, the language, the terminology, readership, and this is the question. Is my force going through?
Yes, I can hear you.
I think these requirements, or let's put them, these competences that you have that you have written here on the front of us: language, familiarity with both languages, source text and the target text, source culture and the target culture. The terminology is very, very important. Not necessarily knowing two languages, this is not enough. We usually ask students to translate, to differentiate between language competence and translation competence. This is very important. The readers you are talking to, I mean the audience, this is very important and in the Palestinian context. This is an issue that our translators face or encounter when they translate sensitive issues to the Western reader, and this, and how the Western reader look at Israel in a democratic or as a democratic country. So this stuff is very important. The translator's role, visibility, invisibility, using Venuti's dichotomy. And I like what you have said, the activism here. And in our case, the translator is an activist, and he is defending his cause. He's defending his country, and of course we should not turn our backs to the ethics. Ethics comes, in my opinion, in number 1, and language in number 6. So all these points are known to the translator, to the feminist translator. But what you are doing here, Dr. Hala, is just reminding our students and reminding them that you are familiar with this, but we need interpretation when you translate. Yeah, you should not lose your sight when you translate. I mean, you should not lose sight of language, terminology, readership, the translator's role, activism, ethics. All these 6 factors or requirements combined should be in front of our eyes before embarking on any translation like the one you are talking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we need to have linguistic mastery of both languages, at least of both languages, understanding of feminist terminology, awareness of prospective readership, awareness of the process of translation as interpretation, as just pointed out, we are interpreters and there is interpretation there, mediation and transformation, political act, translation as a feminist activism, and the ethical implications involved in feminist translation. Now, translation is also connected to agency, very much as in the Palestinian case, because knowledge empowers you. So if you provide evidence in the form of footnotes, for instance, in the form of introductions, and we're talking here about translating books, right? Because this is the entry point of our discussion today. We're not talking about journalistic translation because this is this has its own complications and its own requirements. And perhaps in your case, it would be even more politically acute because of the context that we are addressing. What I would like to highlight is some of the strategies that feminist translation into Arabic uses. One of these is the feminizing language. So how do we make women invisible in a text? Whenever we have the word translator, for instance, in English, it is neutral. So what we do in translation, an option that we have is to always say al-mutargim wal-mutargima, al-mutargimat wal-mutargimun, because in this sense, we are actually emphasizing the presence of women in the text. If you're talking about nas an fighters, right? About, let's say, scholars, let's say about whoever. If you use in Arabic, if you translate it into the common term, then you are actually, when you say al-mutargimun, in Arabic, it is correct that it involves both men and women. But culturally, you tend then to see more men than women in the word al-mutargimun, أو الباحثون, أو المقاتلون, أو المناضلون إلى آخره. Now, another point is that related to terminology. And I'm just going to give you some examples. When you think of terminology, how do we deal with terms? We translate terms, or sometimes we have to coin terms. And in that sense, when we try to translate terms, we are looking for the most accurate equivalent, or we are creating an equivalent. And therefore, we might consider including a glossary if we're translating an article or a book. It can be in the form of a glossary. If it's a shorter text, it can be in the form of a footnote that explains the process of coining terminology. And here I would like quickly to move us to examples like terms like feminism and gender. من الأساس كده, feminism and gender. How do we translate feminism? How do you translate feminism? The word feminism.
النسوية.
Yes. النسوية. احنا مستقرين, right? Yes. في أي مصطلح تاني غير النسوية؟ Not really. Now, how do you translate gender?
النوع الاجتماعي.
Okay. في أي بدائل أخرى؟
الجندر.
الجندر.
Yes. So some translate. So احنا هنا قلنا اللي اتفقنا عليه هو إنه نسوية ملهاش بديل. مش كده؟ قلنا feminism كلنا قلنا نسوية. صح؟
صحيح.
إنما لما قلنا gender.
We can translate it. We can just translate it because exactly. Feminism is familiar to Arabic readers.
ليه familiar بقى؟ What made it familiar؟ ما هو برضو النظرية النسوية دي ما ظهرتش غير كنظرية غير مؤخرا، والجندر على طول بعضكم قال النوع الاجتماعي والبعض قال جندر، وممكن البعض يقول النوع. right؟ النوع. أنا هحكي لكم القصة بقى. أنا حاولت إزاي إن أنا أتتبع أقول جه منين. In Arabic, in our own Egyptian context, and maybe you would like to investigate this again in the Palestinian context, probably it will be similar. لما رجعنا للمصادر النسوية, the sources in the Egyptian history, 1923 الاتحاد النسائي المصري اللي هو كان على فكرة على اتصال برضو بالاتحاد الفلسطيني، وعملوا مؤتمر الشرق كانوا في الثلاثينات لما ابتدت النزوح والثورات. انتوا اكيد ادرى مني بالتاريخ. But the Egyptian Women's Union, الاتحاد النسائي المصري، هو اول مصدر اتكلم في برنامجه على المطالب النسويه. برنامج الاتحاد النسائي المصري اللي هو 1923. The program itself بيتقسم 3 أجزاء: المطالب الوطنية، وكانت متصلة بالاستقلال عن الاحتلال البريطاني. المطالب الاجتماعية، وكان ليها علاقة أكتر بالمجتمع. والقسم النسوي، وده كان معظمه مطالب لها علاقة بالنساء والتعليم وموقع النساء من مؤسسة زي الزواج وتعدد الزوجات والحضانة إلى آخره. كل دي كانت نقط اتناولها وقال عليها بوضوح القسم النسوي. And this is why، والكلمة نفسها مشتقة من النساء. It is an Arabic word, so it has its origin. ما فيهاش سؤال، ما فيهاش questioning. We just found the equivalent immediately, and it has been used for the past 50 years, at least, in even talking about the movement as a movement. With gender, it is slightly different. لأنه gender، مصطلح جندر جالنا، استوردناه. مصطلح الجندر انا ما اعرفش جالكوا ازاي في فلسطين، بس احنا مصطلح الجندر احنا استوردناه، جالنا مع مؤسسات اليو ان organizations. Basically we got it in the 1980s onwards, gender in the documents of the United Nations. وبالتالي مين اللي ترجمه؟ The gender was translated by professional translators working for and with the United Nations. So they translated it as النوع الاجتماعي. However, بعد كده تعددت عندنا في مصر، تعددت الصيغ. ليه؟ Because for the first time later on in the development خلاص استقروا عليه النوع الاجتماعي. طيب في مجال بقى humanities، باحثة زي دكتورة هدى الصدى لما ابتدت تترجم in the 1990s، وهي جاية من الهيومانيتيز، مش جاية من مؤسسات UN organizations، an academic more into cultural studies. To her النوع الاجتماعي had no meaning at all. She knew what it meant, but she said that when it was translated in that way, the readers will understand nothing. You remember we said that we have to have an eye on the readership, how the readership will understand the term. فلما نقول لهم النوع الاجتماعي ما حدش وقتها كان فاهم يعني ايه. فهي she decided to use التشكيل الثقافي والاجتماعي للجنسين. That was what she used as a translation, and then بين قوسين she would say الجندر. In 1999, a group of Arab scholars في الجامعة الأمريكية طلعوا عدد of مجلة ألف in which they discussed knowledge and gender. And they suggested, الدكتورة فريال غزول والدكتورة سامية محرز، they suggested مصطلح الجنوسة كمشتق من مشتق من جناسة، ويبقى على وزن جنوسة على وزن ذكورة وأنوثة. المصطلح اتطرح وقتها but it never picked up. تم استخدامه شوية and then it really didn't pick up. فحاليا أكتر مصطلحين موجودين هما النوع والجندر. I don't know why someone insists on, could someone call her and tell her that I keep muting her or him? And yes, exactly. And they keep unmuting.
Dr. Hala, I think you can block that user. Sorry for the inconvenience. But at the same time, it's good, it's empowering to have mothers around.
Yeah, I know, of course. I don't mind at all. But it's just, yes, that I feel lost a bit. I get distracted. So what happens now is that we have the two terms, النوع الاجتماعي والجندر. واللي بيدعموا استخدام الجندر they believe that gender can be treated as كلمة ذات جذر رباعي، فبالتالي نعملها على انها جا نا دا را، وبالتالي يمكن الاشتقاق. So this is one again position concerning the translation of gender. The last point that I want to raise, and then we can have a bit of a discussion because it's already 6:30, is when we have multiple translations, like in Noah wal gender, and this is just an example. There are many others, of course. When we have these examples, does this tell us something about these terms being untranslatable, or does it mean that it is about being transnational? Because if you have a term that is untranslatable, then maybe you may have multiple versions for it because it is difficult to find an equivalent. But also, if it is a transnational, it moves to and fro, it might have different meanings every time in every context it finds itself in. So this is the question with which I would like to end our discussion. Is there anything that is untranslatable? And if you would like to think of examples of untranslatability in Arabic, English, Arabic translation, and then how do we deal with what strategies can we use to translate the untranslatable? Thank you very much. We can start now an open discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hala, for this very enlightening, very okay. Thank you again very much, Dr. Hala. We have like 50 people joining this talk, which is an amazing thing. Dr. Mahmoud was with us a minute ago, the head of the department. I think he is still with us, in addition to Dr. Muhammad Al-Haj Ahmad. Dr. Mahmoud, would you like to say a word before we hear from the students? Can you hear me? Okay, maybe if you have the chance, before we disconnect in 15 minutes or so. Okay, we have Rahab, Free, Miara, probably others who would like to either ask a brief question or comment, contribute with the particular insight.
Yes, absolutely. So could you please direct the discussion? I'm listening and I'm willing, yes. If you'd like to do it one by one, I'm fine. If you'd like to have a few commenting and then me commenting, it's up to you. You can decide on how to run this.
Let's do one by one and give priority to those who haven't participated already. Ines, go on briefly.
Hello, Doctor. Thank you so much for this lecture. It was very beneficial. For us answering this question, you said about the untranslatability. I had one of the doctors here said that the word Alhamdulillah is untranslatable, even if we have the word thank God, but it is still untranslatable. So I'm not very sure of this information, of this piece of information, but supposing that we are using this as an untranslatable, I think that the best way to do this is transliterate it as it is. And from my experience, I think, and like other words like inshallah and salam and all of these words, I think that they are getting into becoming like universal. Everyone in the world now understands what those words mean. So why should we translate them if we already know that these words can be understood in as they are? Do you think they are untranslatable?
Yes, this is an excellent point. If we notice that even in literature now, I'm not talking here about translation, even in literature, many writers who belong to other cultures, and I can even think immediately of someone like Ahdaf Suwaif, an Egyptian writer who writes in English. She uses those words lately, even Jean Said Maqdisi in her memoir, Teta Mother and Me. when they write, they use those words, as you say, even in literary text, because they have kind of a wide understanding, and because they establish a cultural identity. And also, if you say the translation of Alhamdulillah as thank God, it has a completely different way, because in Arabic we say Alhamdulillah with humility. Thank God in English, it means that something horrible was about to happen, and thank God it didn't happen, right? So the baggage is different, the connotations are different. I would, because I believe in foreignization, I would use Alhamdulillah, but then I would have to provide the reader, in case the reader is not familiar, with either a footnote or a glossary at the end that provides the meanings of those expressions. But yes, I totally agree that these are cultural expressions. If we translate them into their equivalents in English, they already do not have the same meaning. Actually, they can have a completely different meaning, like thank God. You know, in English, when you say thank God, it's not, it's زي الحمدلله ربنا ستر. It's not just Alhamdulillah. The equivalent can be thanks be to God. And thanks be to God is an equivalent because it has a kind of a religious sense in English. Thanks be to God is an expression that is said, that is biblical, that is said in relation to religious situations, during prayer, for instance, in churches. But I agree, and I would go for foreignization, just as much as I would go for translating gender as el-gender.
Thank you very much. We have Amna.
Yes, can I add something?
Go on. Amna, go ahead. Amna, hello. Someone else, Rahaf?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, regarding things that can't be translated, well, I don't want Dr. Rifat to hate me right now for rubbing salt into the wound, let's say. But we've been discussing this a lot lately, and we found that one of the things that are really, really difficult to translate are puns, and some of them are not translatable. Or let's say their effect gets lost in translation. We've discussed a lot how puns could be translated. For me, I would go with using footnotes or writing a side note that would clarify that there was a pun right here. Yeah,
I think it all depends on your approach from the very beginning. Are you domesticating the text, or are you foreignizing the text? Because, and you can clarify this if possible, in an introduction or in a footnote very early on, if there's no space for an introduction, for a translator's introduction. Because if you are going to translate puns literally and then explain them, then this has to be done systematically. So it's not just here that you decide to foreignize and then the rest of the text is domesticated. Nor if you choose to use the equivalent, then you're doing the other way around. I think that's my point. And I think it all depends again on your approach, on your readership. If you're translating to a readership that is completely unaware of the culture, then how are you going to bring the culture closer to them? Otherwise, the puns, if you translate them, they will sound very odd. So it's a big question, actually. And I think that this cannot be solved by one rule that fits all. I think that this is probably why you constantly have discussions, even in your classroom, about how to go about translating puns, for example, and idioms.
Yes.
And metaphors and images, you know, the kind of that become cultural cliches in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Not at all. Someone added in the chat about paratexts, right? And I would like to, who was it who said about paratexts?
It's me, Reem.
Yes. I would like also to bring, you might know about it, the bachelor's, Catherine Batchelor's book, Paratext and Translation, because we know about Gerard Genet's, probably this is what you're familiar with. But Catherine Batchelor wrote a book, which is available PDF online, about paratext and translation, connecting this, highlighting the importance of paratexts to translation. Yes. Any other comments? I'm listening.
Can I ask?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. For the gender and feminism concepts, I got a little bit lost actually. So the most basic here question is that, what is your definition of gender? If it's, because I believe that according to the definition, our understanding of this concept and then the sub concepts and other definitions would also differentiate. Because I read that the concept of feminism emerged at similar times in both the Western world and the Arab world. So the Arabic concept an-Nasawiyya was not that hard to get because it was originally found in Arabic. While concerning the concept of gender, as it traveled between cultures and countries, until scholars and authors transliterated it as gender. But if gender is, if it is directly related to empowering women and giving them their political, their social roles and rights, and feminism is also concerned with same concepts. Why feminism, emerged at similar times as it emerged in the Western world, but for gender it was rooted in European or American communities, and then we brought it up to the Arab world if they have, similar definitions and aspects.
Yes, this is a very important point. I will write in the chat the book of Louise von Flotow, 1997. I think it was her PhD thesis turned into a book, which is Gender and Translation. And the subtitle was Translating in the Age of Feminism, or the Era of Feminism. Now, my personal understanding is that feminism is an ideology. It is grounded in a sense of absence of justice between the two, essentially between men and women. And this was general human experience since probably times immemorial, that only found expression in some documents that have reached us today. In our case, in Egypt, we have the earliest documents go back to the late 19th century. And it was all about women's rights in the society. And to discuss women's rights in the society, you address the authorities. So women would go to parliament demanding laws that would give them certain rights. At the same time, creative writers would write stories that are presenting some equality and alternative vision of the world. And then feminism developed in the West as a theory in the 1970s. So if you go back even in the West, the theory did not develop earlier. You had women writing again in the West, like we had Huda Sha'rawi and Nabawiya Musa writing, and others writing in the early 20th century. In the West, there were women like Virginia Woolf Charlotte Gilman in the United States, again, writing about the position of women in the society. In the 70s, with the feminist movement, women started theorizing, basically academics. In philosophy, they started thinking, how can we make philosophy more less discriminatory against women? How can we include studies about women philosophers? How can we dig for women philosophers? In history, the same thing. In literary studies, the same thing. So this is how you had the development of feminism as a movement, and at the same time on the ground, and at the same time as academic constant exercise. Gender is slightly different. Gender is widening the scope. Gender involves, it came with the social sciences and with basically the concepts of development in political science and sociology. So it was not only about empowering women, it was about masculinity and femininity. And gender, as Joan Scott tells us in one of her important articles, she tells us that gender is an analytical tool. Feminism is not an analytical tool. Feminism is the ideology. And how do you reach this ideology? By studying, by looking at the representations of men and women in politics, the representations of men and women in the media, the representations of the men and women in literature. So it becomes kind of a lens. It's like النضارة اللي بنلبسها وبنبص على العالم من خلالها. لو أنا هدفي to achieve equality, then I'm trying to improve the lives of men and women. Then I am working towards the development. So this is a developmental approach. If my concern primarily is about improving the conditions of women, and then لما حسن أوضاع النساء المجتمع هيتظبط, then my attitude is feminist, which is very similar to Marxists. If you go to Marxists and tell them, we want equality between men and women, they tell you no. If you have social justice, then everything هيتظبط. It's because we live in capitalism. If you go and you talk to secular societies about inequalities, they will tell you it is because we don't have religion. If you impose Islamic government, it will improve everything. So you see, it is ideology. So feminism is more of the ideology. Gender is the analytical tool. If you are more concerned about highlighting the voices of women in a text as a translator, then your focus is feminist. If you are more concerned about trying to dig the history of women writers, then you are a feminist critic. Is this clearer now?
Yeah, thank you. But I asked also for the transliteration of the concept gender, because if we go back to, because the encyclopedia is concerned with the Islamic studies. If we go back in time, as Islam is suitable, for every time and place, and it was the first culture that rooted the concept of equality between women and men. While when we adopt a transliteration strategy, this is more of like foreignizing this concept, as it was rooted in the Western culture, but actually it was rooted in Islamic culture, the equality stuff.
Yes, but if you think about the terminology, let's think, I agree with you, طبعا, but I want you to just think of a term such as a demokratiya. Now, if you have the concept democracy is a concept that has its origin in even pre-Islamic times, الشورى. So why do we use الديمقراطية والنظام الديمقراطي والدعوة إلى انتخابات ديمقراطية وإلى حكومة ديمقراطية؟ ليه ما نستخدمش الشورى؟ ما احنا عندنا المصطلح. It is there culturally. It's a question.
Thank you.
It's a question, right? When it comes to concepts, which is also very similar to objects. يعني احنا طول الوقت بنتكلم على الكمبيوتر. قليل مننا اللي بيتكلم على الحاسب الآلي. right? or كلمني على الموبايل. ما بنقولش، يعني احنا حتى ثقافيا اوكي كان في برنامج في الراديو اوكي في الاذاعه اتصل بيا بالتليفون مش بالهاتف, right? So there are those. The problem is that who produces knowledge. Unfortunately, we at this moment in history are not producers of knowledge. وبالتالي very often when we have terms and technologies that are connected to knowledge produced now, we are at a position of struggling to find equivalence.
Thank you very much for this elaborate discussion of feminism and gender, Dr. Hala. Arwa, are you still there? Dana, can you briefly ask your question? We have like 5 minutes, so try to be brief, please.
Yeah, sure. I want to talk about the untranslatable Arabic words. I think the most difficult words to find a translation for them is Arabic slang words. Actually, I find the difficulty to translate them. I don't think it's only me. Like نعيما, على راسي والله, بلة البحر, or even the most common Syrian slang word, يقبرني or تقبرني. I don't think that we can find an exact translation for them unless we explain the meaning and bring an example of them. I don't know, but how we can solve this issue as translators?
Yeah, I think your point, Dana, is reminds me of the point that was mentioned by your colleague a little earlier about idioms and right, about kinds of expressions. So
yeah, like
I think exactly it all. I think it all depends on what you are translating, your strategy throughout, whether you are going to bring the text, because as you say, Naiman is not easily translated. So, but we need to think what is the equivalent that is said in English in a similar position. So if you have Naiman, someone has just had a haircut, مش كده?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So how are you going to say Naiman? There's no equivalent in English other than what a nice haircut, right?
Yeah, or even they sing it after taking a shower. Naiman.
Or yes, exactly. So I agree. There are those that you cannot translate them because they are very culturally specific. But if you just write Naiman without explaining, then the reader will not understand. And this is why paratexts, as your colleague mentioned in the chat, are important. That it is important in those cases to include footnotes and glossaries. And unfortunately, many publishers do not like to have glossaries and footnotes and introductions because they consider that the text is now, it becomes too academic. It looks too academic for the public readership, and it might affect the sales. But yes, these are very important questions, and I think it all depends on the context. On the list of questions that I raised about not only language but about readership, about your strategy as a whole in the book, about the cultural context and your role as mediator. What are you trying to do through this text? Are you trying to focus on the hadduta, or are you also insisting on showing the specificity, the cultural specificity in your translation? But you have to remember that if you do it, you do it exceedingly, you might lose interest as a reader. The reader might lose interest because they feel lost. There's too much Arabic. There's too much of a culture that they are not familiar with. Very much like when you are an English student at a very early stage in your undergraduate studies and you read literature, you sometimes are lost because of all this reference to a culture of which you have no idea. And you need to translate. You need then to go and look for what is the importance of the globe. And then you understand that the globe is the theater where Shakespeare used to present his plays, for instance. Or Trafalgar Square. What's the significance of Trafalgar Square? Well, it is the point where usually demonstrations take place in London, right? So there are also those cultural references that to us readers without translation sound odd, they sound strange, they sound culturally distant.
Thank you very much. Yara has a brief comment. She tells me. Go on, Yara.
First of all, thank you, Ms. Hala, for this. And I have two comments, actually. The first one is related to transition, and it's I believe that society plays an enormous role in translation. For example, the word gender, there's another Arabic translation that you have mentioned, but this translation, not everyone can use it because some calls it unsuitable or like doesn't prefer to use it. And I'm sure that you understand what I mean. Also, for Arabic words that we can't easily translate to English, like da'a or mada'a, the one that we do with filfil and thum. The other comment is about as a society, and إنه لكل قاعدة شواذ. So we can't use the same thing in all the situation of translation, right? So there isn't a fixed rule that we can follow every time.
Yes, I agree with you, Yara. Yes, it all depends on the situation, and there are, I think you're referring to al-junusa. Al-junusa was a suggested term that I think theoretically would solve the problem, but it didn't pick up.
Yes, because society will not accept it, and it will never accept it because of religious factor.
Exactly,
so
and the
what
sensitivity to the context. Sorry, yes, go ahead.
Well, no, I said that society plays an enormous role in translation.
Exactly, whether something is acceptable or not, especially when it comes to coining terminology, especially with that, right?
Thank you very much. Ala, can you promise to be very brief, you, Rahaf, and Inas, and then we stop the talk quickly, please?
Yes. Okay. Regarding the idea of untranslatability, we have in Arabic a term which is called at-tasghir, when we say bunayya and so on. So simply we can transliterate it, or we can provide footnote or small clarification between brackets. So what is the best strategy to translate a word or at-tasghir in Arabic?
Can you give me an example of a word?
Okay, we have the word bunayya.
Yes. So how would you translate it? I would translate my little girl.
Okay, but when we use at-tasghir in Arabic, it gives thoughts and I don't know, it reflects this point maybe, or
exactly. Yes, I understand, but again, grammatically you don't have an equivalent in you have صيغة التصغير في قواعد اللغة العربية, but you don't have the equivalent in English grammar.
Yeah, the problem is that here with التصغير you can, for example, هريرة, you can say kitten, for example.
Yes.
Sometimes it gets even more problematic if it is also rooted in culture. Like Tamim al-Barghouti says in his poem جداتنا وفي اللهجة القروية أيوة تصغيرك الوقت حين تسمينه بالوقيت. Halugate is a hardcore Palestinian term. It's based on تصغير بالعربي الوقت وقيت and halugate. And it's really, it was very challenging for us. We translated the poem in this course, and it was very challenging. And I think we opted for some kind of explanation. We said how you treat time like a baby, how you deal with time like a baby or something.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes it's really very difficult to find a cultural equivalent.
Rahaf, and then Inas, quickly.
Okay.
So are we keeping Dr. Hala? Are you keeping an eye on the World Cup? Maybe you well, you're working.
No. My husband and my son will come in a minute, and you will just hear the TV on.
Okay.
So,
are they rooting for Brazil?
I think so.
Because Brazil is playing now. So sorry, we're keeping you, but probably hopefully 2 or 3 minutes maximum. So please be brief, everybody.
Okay. Okay. So Dr. Hala, during this really nice lecture, you mentioned something about Gayatri Spivak and her idea that her theory that the translation should be translation as some submission, we said, and you mentioned, I'm not really familiar with her theory, so I'm asking you this question. So what she said is that we need to when someone with a superior position translates a text from a subordinate, let's say another culture that is subordinate to them, politically speaking, they need to submit to that text and translate it specifically as it is. But does that, according to her, does that similarly apply when we are translating a superior text? So we shouldn't opt for, let's say, domestication if we're translating a superior text.
Yes, that's a good point. Now, Gayatri Spivak was writing particularly about what happens, what used to happen to poetry written by Indian men and women when it was translated into English. And she said that it was transformed in a way to show the Indian culture as less civilized, less aware of rules of poetry than the Western tradition. And therefore, she said that translators should actually submit to the text rather than impose themselves on it. She did not go into other power structures, because in the other power structures, the established way is actually that you, as a translator, are of a secondary position. You're not superior. But she said that within colonial structures, translators believe themselves superior to authors. And they believe themselves as transporting this poorly written Indian poetry to something that is more similar to the Western, elevated, superior literature. And therefore, she said, no, you should surrender, which is equivalent to what we now know as basically foreignization.
So she was simply approaching text from a post-colonial point of view, and
absolutely,
yeah, it wasn't a whole theory. Yes.
No. It's basically about post-colonial translation. Yes.
Okay.
Finally, Ines. Thank you very much, Rahaf.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, this lecture is raising many questions in my head, but I'm going to just talk about one point and another small point. The one point that I have is that why are we colonizing the language? I mean, last time I had a talk with a group of male and female, and then I tried to speak with them like using the gender for male and for female. أنتم وأنتن اذهبوا واذهبنا. And then I find it very hard to do this. And then I was thinking that in English we are doing that she and he every time we are referring to a third person because the language itself is neutral. So this is why we are using this. But in Arabic, it is the nature of the language that when we use the male, that using the male refers to both sexes, male and female. Like when we say, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, so this means, or this refers to both sexes. And at the same time, sometimes it says we use the female to refer to both sexes as well, like Ya ayyatuha nafsul mutma'inna. So why do we do this in Arabic when we already have this classification already? This is one question. And the second point here is that just a small point, when my colleague said تؤبرني, for instance, when we use paratext to explain this in Arabic or in English, the explanation itself is very weird. to explain, to translate. So even if I wanted to put a footnote and explain what that means, it would be weird for the reader to understand what I mean. So these are my questions.
Okay, I will start with the second point first, which is about the weirdness. It's weirdness because they are not exposed to it as much as when you translate things from English into Arabic, and you're not familiar with the culture, then it sounds really weird as well. And this becomes clearer in aspects of Western culture that are less familiar to us, such as religious, because we don't really know much about Protestantism and maybe different kinds of sects within Christianity. So if you have a term, you don't really know exactly how to translate it. So this translatability and familiarity is something flexible. It's not very fixed, and it depends on whose culture is more dominant at a certain period in history. And therefore, it requires explanation because it is odd, it is strange, it doesn't really, it is not familiar in any way. And therefore, when you translate from Arabic into English, it becomes even more problematic because your reader is less familiar with Arabic culture than an Arab reader is familiar with the English, American, Western culture in general. Now, to move to your first point, it is important to of course, realize that grammar in Arabic is very clearly الجمع المذكر السالم بيضم الاثنين، تمام؟ But when you use a word في الجمع المذكر السالم, you're not necessarily conscious of the presence of women among these men. وزي ما في القرآن الكريم في صيغة الجمع المذكر السالم addressing men and women, but we also have instances where I don't remember now exactly الآية القرآنية، ولكن في آية قرآنية بعض النساء ذهبن إلى النبي وقالوا له ربك يخاطب الرجال ولا يخاطبنا، فنزلت آية لو أنتم فاكرين، حد فيكم حافظها، اللي هو المؤمنات والمؤمنين. فاكرين الآية؟
الصادقون والصادقات
بالضبط كده، بالضبط كده. and I don't want to say it, but ما هو طب ليه ما قالهاش مرة واحدة وخلاص؟ Because there is insistence here on the presence of women, that it applies on both. Okay, بعد كده بنعمم, but there was a case where it's not ungrammatical to say المترجمون والمترجمات. It's not ungrammatical. You're not breaking a rule. While at the same time أحب أقول لكم إنه في مجموعات عندنا راديكالية كده من الشباب اللي هم بيشتغلوا أكتر على اللغة وعلى الترجمة، وبالذات في التدوين، المدونين والمدونات ابتدوا يخترعوا هم في كتاباتهم، ما بيقولوش مثلا المهتمين والمهتمات، ندعو المهتمين والمهتمات إلى قراءة المدونة الفلانية، بيقولوا المهتميت. اخترعوا صيغة جديدة بتجمع ما بين المذكر السالم والمؤنث السالم، فبيستخدموا دايما المهتموت والمهتميت. طبعا دي it's a radical use, but it is a way of saying that we want to emphasize the presence of both. I'm not advocating for this, but I feel that using the feminine جمع المذكر السالم مصحوبا به معطوفا على جمع المؤنث السالم ليس خطأ لغويا في اللغة العربية، وإنما what it does is it emphasizes that women are included. لأنه لو قلنا المدرس والمدرسون، المدرسون أنا بشوف قدام عينيا صف رجالة، لأنه إحنا نشأنا على كده. So how to emphasize إنه maybe there is a majority actually of مدرسات، هم 10 مدرسات و2 مدرسين. I will still need to use المدرسون لغويا، يبقى جمع مذكر سالم. How to emphasize that there are women there as well? It is by combining both بالعطف.
But this will make any text or any conversation much longer and much harder.
Well, yes, of course, it's up to you. But if you want to emphasize women's presence, then this is what you do. You emphasize it in such ways. and this is now it is being used. يعني احنا اساسا اللغه العربيه بتميل الى الاطناب والاسترسال والتكرار، يعني هي لغه ما هياش بطبيعتها concise، ما جاتش على دي.
Thank you very much. I agree, especially because like usually if you notice, my students would sometimes say the translator he, and then they quickly would say or she, because I've always been kind of pressuring them. Never say,
although they themselves are those women translators.
You are female translators, you are women, you are researchers, you are MA students. I tell them, if you refer to the translator as she, I wouldn't have any problem, because this could create some kind of balance. So redundancy, if it empowers women, Ines, I think it is beneficial sometimes, or mostly. Now, thank you very much, Dr. Hala. We don't want to keep you any longer. Thank you for this really informative and sweet talk. Thank you very much. On behalf of the English department, I'm very thankful to you, and I'm sure my students and the others who joined us here benefited a lot. By the way, some of those speakers are Nadia's classmates, so they're friends with Nadia, so we're the same group, and I'm sure Nadia is also doing a good job right there in Cairo.
Yeah, thank you very much for your kind words, and thank you for inviting me to this talk. It was really a pleasure to have this exchange, and I'm going to thank Nadia when I see her on Wednesday, inshallah.
Dr. Muhammad,
Dr. Rifat,
one final word, go on.
Dr. Rifat, just yes, I know that the class has
الفلسطينية إذا هم برضو نحن نيجي ندافع عليهم، هذا بلان بي. خلص بلان بي أنا بجيب فريق من
Dr. Akram, can you mute? Dr. Akram.
Yes.
Can you mute yourself, please, sir? Can you mute yourself? We can hear.
Okay. Just 1 minute.
Talking in the background. Sorry. Can you go ahead, Dr. Muhammad? We need to
just yes. I know that the class has taken longer, but really we have not felt any we have not felt any bored with this nice class. Just I want to thank Dr. Hala very much for her class, and we hope to see Dr. Hala again, giving classes again, inshallah, for in the future for our class, because I'm sure that the students today have benefited a lot from this interesting class. So we hope to see you, Dr. Hala, in the future, talking to the IEG students again.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. So good night, or probably we need to wish Brazil a good match.
Yes, I guess so. Yes. Time to continue. Yes, watching the match. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll pass the link to everybody who attended here. And
yes, of course. And I will send you the presentation if you think that some of the sources might be helpful.
That would be great. Thank you, everybody who joined us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Assalamu.
شو هذا